Welcome to the debate. Our source material today, which is drawn from an analysis of St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, it really confronts a foundational challenge for any community that's trying to transmit a profound message, and that is the conflict inherent in the method of communication itself.
Yes, exactly. Paul observed these, painful divisions emerging in Corinth, where followers were basically grouping themselves into separate camps. You had clans forming around the influence of individual leaders, like Paul, Apollos, and even Peter, and he attributes this schism directly to the methodology of teaching being used there.
Which brings us really to our central question. In the articulation and spread of profound religious truth, should one prioritize, sophisticated rhetorical skill and human intellectual wisdom, or is that reliance actually counterproductive and fundamentally at odds with the radical simplicity of the core divine message? So, for my part, I'll be arguing that intellectual rigor and eloquence are in fact necessary tools for engaging, for clarifying, and defending the faith. I'll be citing the highly effective ministry of figures like Apollos.
And I'm going to argue that relying on what Paul calls the language of human wisdom, while it inevitably undermines the singular power of the message of the cross, and it leads directly to these destructive divisions, Paul's warning is pretty stark. He says it would render the cross of Christ empty of its power.
Well, let's start with my position. Effective communication, which has to be rooted in intellectual rigor and precision, is just essential for translating profound truths and achieving clarity. The material describes Apollos as a truly, a powerful figure in the early church. It says he was eloquent and deeply versed in the scriptures. And when he came to Corinth, his approach was intellectual and it was vigorous. The text says he publicly refuted the Jews with vigor, demonstrating by the scriptures that the Christ is Jesus. Now, this strategic use of argumentation, logically supporting claims with detailed scriptural evidence, it just demonstrates its vital role in the early church's intellectual defense and, frankly, its missionary reach. You have to remember, Corinth wasn't some sleepy rural village. It was a dynamic, cosmopolitan port city where, as the commentary notes, all currents of thought found echoes.
So, to reach an audience that's sensitive to, quote, beautiful words, you can't just abandon the tools of reasoned discourse. If you abandon that intellectual sophistication, you risk failing to meet the complex needs of educated audiences and relegating the message to an uncritical, marginalized realm.
I see it very differently. For me, Paul's central warning is about the danger inherent in the medium overwhelming the message. He explicitly stated that relying on the language of human wisdom would, quote, make the cross of Christ useless. The medium has to be coherent with the message itself. The commentary makes a great point here. It says you can't announce a God of tenderness by employing violence, even if only verbal violence. And that is often exactly what the force of superior argumentation amounts to. And look at the proof. The very nature of the dispute in Corinth, with people forming factions, saying, I belong to Paul or I belong to Apollos, that's empirical proof of this danger. When eloquence or personal charisma is valued for its own sake, it just fosters rivalry and factionalism. It directly violates Paul's fundamental plea that there should be no division among you. The unifying element he insisted is baptism in the name of Christ, period. So, when the focus shifts to the skills of the evangelist, we lose sight of the divine power. The material uses this really strong metaphor of a successful graft onto Christ, noting that it matters little who the gardener is. And focusing on the rhetorical skill of the gardener, that's precisely the kind of worldly vanity Paul is warning against. Look, we have to understand that Paul isn't just talking about, simplifying complex terms. He's warning against the art of oratory itself, the technical skill of argumentation that's designed to conquer or vanquish. That's really the connotation of the word convince in this context. That technique seeks intellectual submission through human ability. And it's just completely antithetical to the radical simplicity and power of the cross, which triumphs through what looks like weakness. The moment the speaker's skill becomes the focus, the power shifts from God's act to the orator's ability. And the result is the fragmentation Paul deplores. His powerful question, is Christ divided? It reveals that prioritizing human wisdom always results in schism.
Okay, I see why you're emphasizing the danger of, let's say, manipulative rhetoric. But we have to make a sharp, categorical distinction here. There's manipulative rhetoric, the art of winning for its own sake, and then there's the precise language and intellectual rigor necessary for substantive, accurate understanding. You're claiming that intellectual wisdom renders the cross empty. But if we truly reject that, if we reject scholarly rigor, then how do we account for the fact that the source material itself relies so heavily on deep, complex scholarship just to explain the foundations of the faith? I mean, just look at the sheer level of historical and geographical context that's provided to explain the prophecy of Isaiah. We're given detailed geopolitical explanations, the division of the kingdom into Israel and Judah, the Assyrian annexation of Zabulon and Naphtali between 732 and 721 BCE, and the need to decode complex imaged language simply, quote, to better understand the Bible. So isn't this precise, scholarly articulation, which aids a comprehensive understanding of God's action in history, isn't that a form of intellectual wisdom? This kind of rigor, it strengthens faith by providing the contextual evidence for prophecy. It doesn't render the cross empty, it makes the scope and continuity of the divine plan intelligible to a critical mind.
That is a compelling point about the need for scholarly context for understanding prophecy. But I'd argue that while context aids belief, oratory seeks dominance and creates cults of personality. The issue Paul raises is about the source of our assurance, not the necessity of historical documents. The history and the geography are tools for memory, I grant you that. But the ultimate source of assurance lies in simple, radical reliance on God. And I think the historical examples themselves reinforce that very theme.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I don't think that hope is simple. The material itself demonstrates that hope is rooted in a highly complex historical memory. The assurance Isaiah provides that God will never abandon the dynasty of David, that requires correctly interpreting this catastrophic geopolitical schism between Israel and Judah. It requires understanding the legitimacy of the Davidic line based on divine promise. This isn't basic stuff. Applying a past covenant promise to the future, what the text calls the memory of the future, that is not an uncritical or a simple act. It requires skillful instruction, deep textual knowledge, really an Apollos-like ability to ensure this complex memory is preserved and correctly applied to figures like King Hezekiah. If those historical and theological details are lost or, poorly communicated, then the hope itself becomes shallow and unfounded.
I appreciate the complexity of Davidic covenant theology, I really do. But I think your focus on intellectual complexity misses Paul's core point entirely. The specific historical examples that are cited in the material, they actually favor radical simplicity and faith over complex intellectual or strategic analysis. They undercut the argument for sophisticated methodology. I mean, take Gideon's famous victory over the Midianites. The source material holds that up as a type of future victory for Israel. The commentary emphasizes that Gideon secured this victory with only 300 men, who were, quote, armed only with lights and trumpets. The secret to their success, the text confirms, was their simple faith in the presence of God, not strategic or rhetorical dominance over a vastly larger army. The power was God's, and it was revealed through human weakness, not human calculation. Right, and it's the same thing when Isaiah confronted King Ahaz, whose heart was trembling as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. The prophet's warning was profoundly simple. It was utterly non-intellectual. He said, if you do not believe, you will not hold firm. That concept of holding firm, tanir in the original, is tied directly to the Hebrew root that gives us the word amen. It means to believe, to hold firm in faith. The requirement is simple faith, and that overrides any need for a sophisticated political, military, or rhetorical analysis to maintain stability. The prophetic message is effective precisely because it bypasses our human intellectual capacity and demands only submission and faith.
I agree faith is paramount, and yes, Gideon's victory underscores divine power. But to communicate that complex historical lesson accurately, why 300 men succeeded, why the Davidic line matters, you need precision. This tension seems to boil down to whether the instruction that enables understanding falls under the umbrella of the worldly wisdom that Paul condemns. And I would submit that structural wisdom, the clear articulation of chronology, geography, covenant law, is necessary for belief to be grounded in substance rather than just sentiment. It's the difference between knowing that God saves and understanding how God saves across millennia. Apollos was critical for teaching the how.
And yet the tension was so real, it produced practical negative consequences. And they were recognized by the very person you're championing. This isn't just some theoretical dispute about rhetoric. It had real fallout that even the most talented communicators had to deal with. The commentary notes that Apollos, despite his effectiveness, he refused Paul's urging to return to Corinth. And the text suggests it was likely in order not to worsen tensions in the Christian community. Now, that refusal, this deliberate stepping back from the spotlight of his own powerful influence, it suggests that Apollos himself recognized the divisive power of his own eloquence when it was misused by the audience. His action is a practical endorsement of Paul's position. If a gift, even a genuine one, causes schism and rivalry, the messenger has to moderate or withdraw it. He chose communal peace over his personal ability to preach, and that shows that intellectual gifts carry these unique dangers of creating cults of personality that distract from Christ.
See, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it profoundly mislocates the fault. You're indicting the tool because of the failure of the handler, or in this case, the recipient. The problem, as is described, lay squarely with the enthusiasm of the neophytes who were led to compare the quality of the message delivered by the different preachers. They were the ones focusing on personalities, which led to the clans. But that's a failure of the audience's spiritual maturity, their ungodly sense of intellectual competition. It's not an indictment of Apollos' intellectual skill itself. Eloquence is morally neutral. It can be used for Christ or for self-aggrandizement. And what's more, the Acts of the Apostles describes Apollos as being a fervent Christian whose understanding was just incomplete at first. When Priscilla and Aquila exposed the way of God with greater precision, his recognized eloquence became an incredibly effective tool for good. It allowed him to publicly and accurately refute the Jews. The narrative implies that once his theology was grounded and precise, his skill became entirely beneficial. The failure belongs entirely to the Corinthian community that valued the speaker's charisma over the unified Christ being announced. Apollos' stepping back might have been charitable, sure, but if we abandon effective tools just because a spiritually immature audience misuses them, we are self-handicapping our own mission. We can't let the lowest common denominator of spiritual maturity dictate the quality of our instruction.
But Paul's letter isn't addressed to Apollos. It's addressed to the entire community, and he places the blame squarely on the methodology, the use of the language of human wisdom. He did that because he understood that the power of the cross is, by worldly standards, folly. It requires a means of communication that underscores weakness, not human strength. The moment a speaker uses their own intellectual superiority to persuade, they replace the power of God with the force of their own personality. The goal of the gospel is unity in Christ. And if the instrument of transmission is causing division by promoting rivalry, well, the material itself demands its rejection. Apollos' temporary withdrawal just underscores the constant vigilance we need to make sure our gifts don't become idols.
I agree. Constant vigilance is required. The challenge, though, is that without intellectual rigor, the faith becomes untethered from history and reason. I mean, we are forced to rely on complex, scholarly decoding to understand the historical fulfillment of prophecy, the geographical scope of God's promise to Zabulon and Naphtali, and the internal logic of the covenants. If we strip away the ability to articulate these complexities with precision, we risk creating a faith that's based solely on emotion, vulnerable to attack. The tension we face is between achieving simplicity for the sake of internal unity and embracing sophistication for the necessity of intellectual engagement, for transmission in a world that demands reasoned answers.
And that is exactly where the distinction must be drawn between reasoned answers that serve truth and rhetorical techniques that serve victory. The ultimate measure for Paul is whether the messenger and their methodology draw attention toward the divine act of the cross, or whether human attributes, charisma, eloquence, debating skill,
overshadow that act and lead to rivalry. Paul's admonition really serves as a perpetual check against allowing intellectual competition and human pride to tear apart a community that's unified only in baptism. We must never confuse necessary clarity with unnecessary dominance.
Which means this enduring tension requires continuous and careful assessment by anyone who transmits the message. It's a balance between fidelity to the simple core truth and the need to articulate that truth powerfully and accurately in a world full of competing and sophisticated ideas.
And it leaves all of us with the challenging task of discerning in every act of teaching which form of communication truly serves the message of Christ and which one merely elevates the status of the messenger.